At the six-star hotel, no one understood the Chinese billionaire until the black maid spoke Mandarin. The marble floors of the Grand Imperial Hotel gleam like mirrors reflecting the chaos of miscommunication as Chinese tech billionaire Chen Weiming stands in the opulent lobby, her urgent Mandarin falling on deaf ears while staff scramble helplessly around her. Their expensive education's useless against a language barrier that threatens to derail negotiations worth $3 billion. At the concierge desk, managers fluent in French, Spanish, and German offer apologetic shrugs while the hotel's reputation for perfection crumbles under the weight of assumptions that money can solve problems that understanding requires. 20 feet away, invisible in her pressed uniform, 34-year-old Maya Washington continues polishing brass fixtures with movements that hide her PhD in international business and 15 years of experience working in Shanghai, her fluent Mandarin silenced by a society that measures worth through job titles rather than knowledge, skin color rather than capability, uniform rather than the brilliant mind that circumstances have disguised but never diminished. The Grand Imperial Hotel stands as monument to American luxury, its six-star rating reflecting service standards that the world's elite expect when power and wealth converge in spaces designed to accommodate every conceivable need, except the simple human requirement for authentic communication between minds that language barriers can separate, but understanding must bridge when business demands connection that protocol cannot substitute for genuine comprehension. Chen Weiming's presence in the lobby represents more than individual crisis. Her pharmaceutical empire's expansion into American markets could revolutionize healthcare accessibility while creating thousands of jobs. But cultural misunderstandings threaten partnerships that innovation requires when breakthrough thinking meets bureaucratic blindness to resources that exist outside traditional channels. The hotel's multilingual staff represents United Nations of privilege, their expensive language training from elite institutions providing fluency in European tongues that serve wealthy clientele from familiar markets, while leaving them helpless when confronted with languages that global business increasingly demands, but that American education often treats as exotic rather than essential when opportunities for connection exist beyond comfort zones that prosperity creates. French flows freely between staff and Parisian investors. Italian smooths negotiations with Milan fashion houses. But Mandarin remains mysterious despite representing the language of the world's second-largest economy, whose partnerships American businesses desperately need, but cultural arrogance often prevents when assumptions about superiority create barriers that humility could dissolve. Maya observes the mounting crisis from her position near the elevator bank, her housekeeping duties providing perfect vantage point for witnessing organizational failure that expensive training couldn't prevent when competence requires more than credentials can provide, when effectiveness demands resources that exist in unexpected places, when solutions require recognition that wisdom doesn't announce itself through familiar channels but often hides behind assumptions that prejudice maintains. Despite evidence that capability transcends circumstances when opportunity meets preparation regardless of packaging that might conceal rather than reveal qualifications that crisis demands. Her mind automatically processes Chen Weiming's increasingly urgent requests, understanding flowing naturally despite barriers that separate their worlds through social distance that economics creates, but that language could bridge if recognition allowed connection. Chen Weiming's frustration builds with each failed attempt at communication, her time-sensitive medical emergency requiring immediate assistance that the hotel's legendary service cannot provide when language becomes barrier rather than bridge. When assumptions about guest needs prove inadequate for addressing crisis that cultural competence could solve, but that monolingual staff cannot navigate despite advanced degrees that apparently didn't include practical training for serving global economy, whose demands transcend comfortable assumptions about who deserves consideration when expertise becomes essential regardless of its packaging or presentation through circumstances that might suggest inadequacy rather than hidden capability. The irony cuts deep as Maya continues her invisible labor while watching highly paid professionals fail at tasks that her background has prepared her to handle effortlessly. Their helplessness revealing gaps in institutional preparation that money cannot fill when competence requires more than credentials can provide, when effectiveness demands recognition that wisdom exists in unexpected places, when solutions require acknowledgement that value transcends visible markers that society uses to determine worth despite evidence that capability often hides behind circumstances that prejudice uses to justify dismissal of human resources whose potential remains untapped through assumptions that measurement obscures rather than reveals true qualifications for addressing challenges that crisis inevitably presents. Maya's journey to this moment began in Detroit, where economic collapse had shuttered automotive plants, sending families like hers searching for stability that education promised, but circumstances often denied, when opportunity required adaptation that comfort zones couldn't provide, when survival demanded skills that traditional pathways hadn't taught, but that necessity had made essential for navigating economy that rewarded flexibility over predictability, innovation over convention, capability over credentials, when crisis revealed differences between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom that experience develops through challenges that textbooks cannot anticipate or academic preparation cannot fully address, when reality demands responses that formal training hasn't provided. Her undergraduate degree in international business from Wayne State University had led to MBA studies in Shanghai, where full scholarship had provided access to education that American institutions couldn't offer at prices that family finances could afford. Her academic excellence opening doors that domestic prejudice might have kept closed, when merit met opportunity in environments that valued results over assumptions about potential based on characteristics unrelated to intellectual capability or professional competence. 5 years in China had provided language fluency that immersion creates, but that classroom study cannot replicate, cultural understanding that living abroad develops, but that tourism cannot provide, business insights that international experience teaches, but that domestic education often overlooks, when global perspective becomes essential for navigating markets that success increasingly requires. The 2008 financial crisis had destroyed career plans that degree should have guaranteed, her return to America coinciding with economic devastation that eliminated positions regardless of qualifications, when survival trumped advancement, when any employment became preferable to none despite education that suggested better options should exist in marketplace that reality had proven more discriminatory than merit-based, when opportunity contracted faster than preparation could adapt to, circumstances that determination could survive, but that comfort could not endure. Hotel housekeeping provided steady income that supported elderly parents while she searched for business positions that economic recovery would eventually create, her service work becoming temporary necessity that circumstances extended beyond original intentions, when stability mattered more than career advancement, during period when survival required practical choices rather than idealistic expectations. The work itself had revealed dignity that society often denies to service professions, her responsibilities requiring attention to detail that business training had developed, organizational skills that management education had refined, cultural sensitivity that international experience had taught, when guests from every continent expected understanding that protocols could guide, but that genuine competence had to provide through knowledge that formal training might begin, but that practical application must complete, when effectiveness demands more than theory, can teach about human interaction across barriers that language creates, but that wisdom can transcend, when recognition allows connection despite differences that superficial observation might emphasize rather than minimize. Her colleagues in housekeeping represent United Nations of survival, their stories revealing international credentials reduced to service work through circumstances that education couldn't prevent, when economic forces created displacement that qualifications couldn't overcome, when global economy demanded flexibility that traditional career paths hadn't anticipated, when survival required adaptation that pride might resist, but that necessity ultimately demanded, when reality proved more complex. Then planning had predicted despite preparation that should have provided security, but that circumstances had revealed as insufficient for navigating challenges that individual effort couldn't control regardless of merit, that society claimed to reward, but that practice often ignored when opportunity required recognition that assumptions prevented. Today's crisis represents convergence of preparation and opportunity that Maya's background has uniquely equipped her to address. Her language skills and cultural knowledge providing exactly what situation demands, but that social position prevents her from offering when hierarchy creates barriers that effectiveness should dissolve, when protocol becomes obstacle rather than assistance, when assumptions about worth prevent recognition of resources that exist outside traditional channels despite evidence that capability transcends circumstances, when crisis demands solutions that competence can provide regardless of packaging that might conceal rather than reveal qualifications that emergency situations require for resolution that conventional approaches cannot achieve. Chen Weiming's medical emergency escalates as precious minutes tick away while hotel staff engage in increasingly frantic consultations that produce sympathy but no solutions. Their expensive communications training proving useless when language barriers prevent understanding that life-threatening situations demand regardless of protocols that normal circumstances might allow, when time permits careful consideration of options that crisis eliminates through urgency that brooks no delay, when human welfare hangs in balance, that miscommunication could tip toward tragedy through institutional failure, that competence could prevent if recognition allowed access to resources that exist but remain invisible through assumptions that measurement obscures. The situation deteriorates as Chen Weiming's attempts to explain her daughter's allergic reaction to hotel amenities meet with blank stares that empathy cannot overcome, when comprehension requires linguistic skills that staff training apparently hadn't prioritized despite global clientele that business serves, international markets that success demands, multicultural competence that excellence requires, when service transcends simple hospitality to become bridge between worlds that language can connect, but that ignorance inevitably separates, when preparation proves inadequate for addressing challenges that global economy routinely presents to organizations whose scope exceeds their cultural preparation. Hotel management arrives with authority that cannot substitute for understanding, when power meets its limits against problems that hierarchy cannot solve, when credentials prove insufficient for addressing crisis that practical knowledge could resolve, but that social barriers prevent accessing through assumptions about worth that circumstances can contradict, but that prejudice maintains despite evidence that capability exists in forms that recognition might refuse to acknowledge, when opportunity demands responses that competence can provide regardless of its social packaging or institutional validation through channels that crisis bypasses, when necessity demands immediate action. Maya watches the mounting chaos with growing concern for Chen Weiming's evident distress. Her professional training recognizing signs of panic, that language barriers intensify when medical emergencies require precise communication, that miscommunication could transform from manageable crisis into preventable tragedy through institutional failure, that individual competence could address if social barriers didn't prevent access to resources that exist outside traditional channels, where expertise often hides behind circumstances that assumptions use to justify dismissal of human potential, whose value transcends visible markers that prejudice employs for measurement. The moment of decision arrives when Chen Weiming collapses from stress and frustration, her fall creating physical crisis that medical emergency could become if communication failures prevent proper care, that understanding could facilitate, but that language barriers threaten to make impossible when help exists nearby but remains inaccessible through social distance that education creates between people whose circumstances differ but whose human needs transcend superficial distinctions, that society maintains despite evidence that connection serves everyone better than separation, when crisis demands cooperation across lines that comfort draws but that necessity must cross. Maya drops her cleaning supplies and moves toward Chen Weiming with purpose that years of crisis management have taught her to maintain under pressure. Her approach drawing suspicious looks from staff whose training emphasized protocol over flexibility, procedure over humanity, hierarchy over effectiveness when situations demand responses that institutional preparation cannot anticipate, but that individual competence must provide when crisis bypasses normal channels to demand direct action. From people whose qualifications might exist outside traditional validation, but whose capability becomes essential when conventional resources prove inadequate for addressing challenges that reality presents regardless of organizational preparation or theoretical training. Maya asks in fluent Mandarin as she kneels beside Chen Weiming, her words creating moment of shock throughout lobby as hotel staff process impossible sight of housekeeping employees speaking language that their expensive educations hadn't provided. Their assumptions about competence based on job titles suddenly revealed as inadequate when capability emerges from sources that prejudice had rendered invisible despite presence that proximity should have made obvious if recognition hadn't been. Blocked by barriers that social position creates between people whose circumstances differ, but whose potential transcends superficial measurements that appearance suggests rather than reveals. Chen Weiming's response comes as flood of relief mixed with Mandarin explanation of medical crisis that Maya's cultural knowledge allows her to understand not just linguistically, but contextually, her years in China providing insights into business protocols, family obligations, and medical practices that translation alone cannot convey when cultural competence requires more than vocabulary can provide. When understanding demands appreciation for values that language carries, but that superficial knowledge cannot access without deep immersion that experience creates through commitment that casual study cannot match, when authenticity demands engagement that tourism cannot substitute for genuine cultural education. Maya responds, her words carrying authority that competence provides when expertise meets crisis, when preparation encounters opportunity, when hidden capabilities emerge to address challenges that conventional resources cannot handle despite expensive training that apparently hadn't anticipated situations that global economy routinely creates, when business transcends borders that education often maintains through assumptions about whose knowledge matters when effectiveness requires recognition that wisdom exists everywhere, but gets acknowledged only when desperation forces recognition of resources that prejudice typically renders invisible. The transformation in Chen Weiming's demeanor is immediate and dramatic as communication becomes possible, her panic subsiding as understanding replaces confusion, connection substitutes for isolation. Hope emerges where desperation had grown, when language barriers dissolve through competence that proximity had provided, but that social blindness had prevented accessing until crisis forced recognition of resources that institutional training hadn't identified despite presence that should have been obvious if assumptions hadn't created barriers between people whose circumstances differed, but whose humanity demanded recognition regardless of social position or professional status, when crisis reveals what matters most. Hotel staff gather in amazement as Maya coordinates medical response with efficiency that emergency training provides when preparation meets opportunity. Her bilingual capabilities allowing precise communication with paramedics while cultural knowledge helps navigate family dynamics that Chinese business culture requires when personal crisis intersects with professional obligations in ways that Western protocols cannot anticipate, but that international experience teaches when immersion provides. Education that formal study cannot replicate through depth that living abroad creates, but that academic preparation can only approximate when theory meets practice. The medical emergency resolves through Maya's intervention as allergic reaction receives proper treatment that could have been delayed indefinitely by communication failures that her language skills prevented. Her cultural competence ensuring that family notifications follow appropriate protocols while business obligations receive consideration that crisis demanded, but that misunderstanding could have compromised through institutional blindness to resources that existence nearby, but remained. inaccessible until recognition allowed access to capabilities that prejudice had hidden behind assumptions about worth that circumstances can contradict when opportunity meets preparation regardless of packaging that might conceal rather than reveal qualifications. The aftermath of Chen Weiming's successful treatment creates ripple effects throughout hotel as management processes implications of discovering PhD-level expertise disguised as housekeeping staff. Their assumptions about human resources revealed as inadequate when capability emerges from sources that hiring practices hadn't identified despite presence that proximity should have made obvious if recognition systems hadn't been designed around credentials rather than competence when. Effectiveness requires acknowledgement that worth transcends visible markers that society uses for measurement despite evidence that value exists in forms that prejudice might refuse to acknowledge. Chen Weiming's gratitude extends beyond immediate medical crisis to recognition of systemic waste that organizations perpetuate when brilliant minds remain invisible through assumptions that job titles determine capability rather than revealing it. When social position becomes barrier rather than indicator of potential. When prejudice prevents access to resources that exist in abundance but remain untapped through institutional blindness that effectiveness should cure but that comfort often maintains. When change requires acknowledgement that current systems fail to identify or develop human potential whose value transcends circumstances that might suggest inadequacy rather than hidden strength. Chen Weiming tells Maya as medical situation stabilizes, her praise carrying recognition that linguistic competence requires more than casual study can provide, that cultural understanding demands commitment that tourism cannot create. That expertise exists in forms that formal validation might not acknowledge, but that practical application demonstrates through results that crisis reveals when conventional approaches prove inadequate for addressing challenges that reality presents regardless of theoretical preparation or institutional credentials that appearance might suggest rather than confirm. The hotel's general manager approaches with mixture of amazement and embarrassment as organizational failure becomes apparent through success that employee whom hiring practices had categorized as unskilled had provided when crisis demanded competence that expensive training apparently hadn't developed in staff, whose credentials suggested capability, but whose performance revealed limitations that preparation hadn't addressed. When global business requires cultural fluency that education often treats as optional rather than essential for serving clientele whose needs transcend comfortable assumptions about what service requires when excellence demands more than protocol can provide. Maya's revelation of her background creates institutional crisis as management realizes that PhD-level expertise in international business has been wasted through housekeeping assignments for 3 years, while conference rooms hosted expensive consultants whose advice couldn't match insights that proximity had provided, but that recognition hadn't allowed accessing. When hierarchy creates barriers between wisdom and application, knowledge and opportunity, capability and utilization, that organizational design should bridge, but that prejudice often maintains through assumptions that appearance suggests rather than investigation reveals when potential exists outside traditional channels. Chen Weiming's business empire operates through principles that recognize talent regardless of its packaging. Her success built on identifying capabilities that competitors overlook when prejudice prevents recognition of resources that exist everywhere, but get acknowledged only when results demonstrate value that assumptions might deny, but that effectiveness cannot ignore when performance transcends expectations that limited thinking creates about human potential whose worth often exceeds visible indicators that society uses for measurement despite evidence, that capability emerges from sources that open minds can identify, but that closed systems typically miss when opportunity demands recognition. The pharmaceutical negotiations that had brought Chen Weiming to America proceed with Maya serving as cultural liaison whose insights bridge gaps that formal diplomacy cannot cross when understanding requires more than translation can provide. When connection demands appreciation for values that language carries, but that superficial knowledge cannot access without depth that experience creates through engagement, that academic study can introduce, but that immersion must complete when authenticity requires commitment that casual interest cannot sustain, but that genuine respect must maintain when partnership serves mutual benefit rather than one-sided exploitation. Maya's transformation from invisible housekeeping staff to essential business consultant demonstrates what becomes possible when organizations choose recognition over assumption, capability over credentials, results over prejudice when human resources receive evaluation that circumstances cannot adequately reveal, but that opportunity must provide if potential is to serve purposes that benefit everyone rather than remaining wasted through institutional blindness that effectiveness should cure. But that comfort often perpetuates when change requires acknowledgement that current systems fail to identify or develop talent whose value transcends visible markers that measurement typically employs despite evidence that worth exists in forms that recognition must learn to appreciate. As negotiations conclude successfully through cultural bridges that Maya's expertise provided, Chen Wei-Ming establishes scholarship fund for international business students, while Hotel implements hiring practices that recognize capability regardless of its current circumstances. Their collaboration, creating systemic changes that address organizational blindness to human resources whose potential exists everywhere, but gets acknowledged only when crisis forces recognition of value that prejudice typically renders invisible despite presence, that proximity should make obvious if assumptions didn't create barriers between wisdom and application, when effectiveness demands access to competence that exists outside traditional channels, but serves essential purposes when opportunity meets preparation regardless of packaging. The black maid who spoke Mandarin becomes catalyst for transformation that extends far beyond single business deal into recognition that brilliance doesn't announce itself through familiar channels, that expertise often hides behind circumstances that society uses to justify dismissal rather than investigation, that human potential transcends visible markers when capability requires acknowledgement rather than assumption, understanding rather than prejudice, recognition rather than dismissal. When value exists in forms that open minds can identify, but that closed systems typically miss despite evidence that effectiveness demands access to resources that exist everywhere, when wisdom chooses connection over separation, capability over credentials, results over comfortable assumptions that limit rather than expand recognition of human worth whose potential serves everyone better when acknowledged rather than ignored.